Hey, Nick Smoot here. I am the founder of Innovation Collective, and we are on my YouTube page. And here it is a page where I am exploring the American dream and this thing we've been doing where for the last 8 years we've been rebuilding this system that helps cities across the country rebuild the American dream in a practical way with tech at the center of it, but not making it all about tech, making it about humans and humans getting to pursue a higher sense of self, a person who's inspired, that's learning new skills, that's contributing value, really the American dream. And we believe that the knowledge economy and tech is where a lot of people want to go because of the value there. However, we're also not forcing anybody to go there. If you want to make pottery, make pottery. That's awesome. Like, learn new skills, contribute value. And all of these interviews, I interview random people, single parents, homeless people, venture capitalists, owners of big companies, politicians, economists, professors, presidents of colleges, all sorts of fun, crazy people that I interact with as we build this system across the country. So today, I am interviewing an incredibly fascinating person who has been right at the intersection of entrepreneurship and policy for quite a while. His name is Victor, and Victor has been at this company called Kauffman Foundation. It's more of a big nonprofit organization, and they've been handling kind of what is it going to take to build better ecosystems across this country. That's been their argument, and Victor's been working like a dog on that. And he realized something, that one of the things we need is an organization that really boosts the ability for politicians and citizens to have a framework of what kind of policy is necessary to unleash the right to start. For everyone to feel like, hey, it's my right to go start a company. And how do I go about that? And he's done a good job. In this interview, we're going to talk a long time about ecosystems and what is hurting small towns, what is helping small towns, ideas that we both have. And it's awesome. I like Victor. I like his work. Please go to righttostart.org, I believe, and support Victor and all the work he's doing. I'm a huge fan of it. I think he and I are two peas in a pod. Two peas in a pod. So enjoy the interview. I'm going to shut up now. If you have no idea what we're about, go check out innovationcollective.co. Join one of our communities. We're popping up all across the country. We're in 4 states now. And we have a festival coming up in October, some leadership summits. There are fireside chats happening all over. And it's all about unleashing human potential through a really fun, grassroots, old world model of relationships. Kind of crazy. All right, I'm going to go. Enjoy the interview. Okay. Well, hello. I am here with Victor Hwang. Yes?
Yes.
I want to make sure I get that correct. And he is the founder of Right to Start, as well as you've heard, has a good background in entrepreneurship a bit, Kauffman Foundation, and is deeply concerned about the American dream and really how to get people back to creating again, which we're going to have a really long conversation about the science of that, around the American dream, about his time with Kauffman, and in more specifics, how you can be involved in Right to Start and what does this all mean. We're going to talk for a while, but let's just start out of the gate. Tell us a little bit about your world, kind of early pre-Kauffman, you as an entrepreneur, understanding why does this matter to you, I guess.
Well, if you go back far enough, this goes back to my own founding as a human being. My parents, came to the U.S. as immigrants, and they were both educators, and so, as part of, I'm of Chinese ancestry. As part of Chinese ancestry and Taiwanese ancestry, where my parents came from, education's hugely important. So I was very lucky enough to be able to get into Harvard, and so my parents just said go. They didn't really tell me what it would cost to do it, and what I didn't know at the time was they had to take out a second mortgage on their house, and they had to end up starting a business to be able to pay for me to go to Harvard. And it was that business that became moderately successful and actually paid for tuition, and has provided a small nest egg for them. But so I know how entrepreneurship can empower people and it gives them opportunity. But the irony is when I was at Harvard during the first week of classes, I actually attended the introductory economics class, which was taught by former presidential economic advisor. And I remember after the first day of class, I thought, You know what? That doesn't make any sense at all. And I actually never went back to intro economics again at Harvard after the first day, because I thought what they're speaking about is it doesn't account for ordinary people like my parents starting their business, like
Hmm.
the person that's just trying to live their life. And you can't look at these questions from 30,000 feet. You have to get deep into get your fingers dirty in this kind
Yeah.
of stuff to understand where real economic wealth comes from. And so that really sort of became the seed of this idea of where I've ended up. And so since then, I've really been spending my whole life in one way or other trying to figure out that question of where does the good life come from? How do we actually create that kind of prosperity? And
Hmm.
I'm lucky enough to have traveled to many, many places, and I've seen my parents' home country of Taiwan transform over decades from being, a society that was, struggling and kind of coming up and developing and emerging to actually a very prosperous, society today. And I've seen places across the country, and I've seen
Yeah.
cities just transform too.
Talk to me a little bit about, so I'm super interested in human nature, human flourishing. I like to use the word, I totally stole it from one of my board members, but eudaimonia, which means human flourishing. And it feels like in the United States, we have blown through the hierarchy of needs for the most part. Like, it's kind of there and within arm's reach for most citizens in this country. Yet the happiness is really not tracking with that. Like, the progress of abundance fiscally or financially has gone this way, and happiness seems to kind of have flatlined and or dropped. And you were mentioning about your parents' country of Taiwan and watching them become more abundant, more prosperous. Have you seen any studies at Kauffman and or in like the science and research on happiness tied to what key indicators in that progress march up? Because if it's really just about more dollars, let's be honest, GDP is the right metric. But I don't really, like, I personally don't know if that is the full bodied metric to really show true progress for a country. Because like, hypothetically, you could have all money made next year could be because of Victor, and we could have our GDP go up and yay, we're winning. But like, is that really winning? And what about the other indicators in that? So are there any studies that you've seen around the happiness and progress, and what are those, where are they in lockstep together, like for the progress and the happiness? Or is it just more anecdotal things that you see that are stories or narratives that you've watched, tracked?
Mm.
Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. Well,
Okay.
there is that. It's pretty well known research around something like, I think this is in the U.S. Like people making above $70,000 to $75,000 a
Mm-hmm.
year. That marginal dollar actually doesn't make them any happier. Like it kind of tops out. Like at some point, you do need a basic level of subsistence, right? Like you were saying,
Yeah.
climbing up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like you need to get to a point where you're not living in terror, right, and
Yeah.
fear
Yep.
of the next thing, and that's a huge deal, obviously. And my parents came out of that world, and they know, and so I'm not that far removed from it. Um, but I do think it's a real question around what does human flourishing look like? And I've actually always thought of, not always, I think I've come to realize that Maslow's hierarchy, it ends at the tip of the pyramid, but there's actually something above that tip of the pyramid. There's actually another pyramid on top of that,
Yeah.
because the Maslow hierarchy assumes that individual flourishing is the ultimate achievement. But if you actually think about our own lives, that's not it at all, right? It's
Right.
flourishing. It's your individual flourishing within a flourishing of a community around you that becomes like the next pyramid on top of that. So you can
Yeah.
actually imagine an inverted pyramid on top of the existing pyramid, where the individual starts to become part of, a family, part of a broader community, part of a broader society that is that true flourishing. And I think the question you're getting at is, how do we actually measure that scientifically or research
Sure.
wise? And it doesn't really exist. I mean, it's well, there's well documented cases of, I think it's Bhutan that's created the gross happiness index and things
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
What is happiness? What is fulfillment? I think we're all struggling with that. But I will tell you this, when I've seen a lot of places, which is people thrive economically when they're allowed to create and make and build their own things, that they're allowed
Mm-hmm.
to use their talents in the best way possible, right? Whether that's being an artist or a singer or a writer or, an organizational builder of some kind, or creating products or whatever. Everyone is born with a different set of talents, and a truly great society is one that lets those talents flourish to the maximum extent possible. And I've seen it. I mean, you see this, I'll give you an example. So when I was, this was about 15 years ago now, I first moved to Silicon Valley, and I'd been there many times, but I actually moved there and spent time there. And it was within the first couple of years there, I realized Silicon Valley was not at all what I thought it was. Like, a lot of people come from the outside and they think, well, it's the big companies, it's the big venture capital firms, it's all that. But if you spend time living there, you realize it's the stuff that people don't write about that make it what it is, which is, the maker community. Even before there was a maker community that was there, like the hobbyist community. I've never seen a city more passionate about its hobbies, like actively making hobbies, like doing stuff, than the Bay Area is. And there's that sense of joy and pursuit of creating something new or becoming an expert in some obscure thing that really permeates the Bay Area. And I think that's combination of sort of personal freedom to explore around with a community's willingness to support and nurture that spirit is actually what made the Valley the Valley. So if you go back like way in history, those were the root seeds, and it's very, and it carries forth, right? It kind of ripples for decades afterwards.
Well, and if you think about, so curiosity, I think curiosity is one of those really soupy currencies that gets overlooked once in a while. Like it is a great town where people are happy, productive, connected. There's a sense of shared respect for one's curiosity. And it can become such a unifying force. In our work with Innovation Collective, we've continued to see it as this lightning rod that you hold up in a town, and it starts to kind of pull back the curtain on some of the bias that you've had around your neighbor, because everyone has a curiosity, everyone has, passions, the ideas they have for a company or what have you. And no longer does their religion matter, their pay grade, their socioeconomic status, their race, like kind of out the door, because now it's like, tell me about your weird thing, because I've got my weird thing. And it's you mentioned about San Francisco, that nails it on the head. It's like everyone there, like maybe they had their job with, the military industrial complex at the beginning of Silicon Valley, because that's, kind of what fed the kitty to get all these weirdos together. It was like the federal government dumping money in to make sure we didn't get beat in wars. Largest employer till the 90s, I think, was like, it was one of the big military contractors in the Bay. And now that's shifted, but it's like they all were working on that. But like over here, it was like, well, here's my real little kind of crazy pet project. And that plays into maybe two things I want to kind of poke a stick at. In particular, your jump from the Bay to Kauffman Foundation, where you worked, which for those who don't know what Kauffman Foundation is, for people who care about entrepreneurial ecosystems, it's kind of the premier, entity that is trying to uncover what is this North Star, like for everyone to follow, that empowers entrepreneurship, that unlocks this human potential across our country. Fairly academic in some ways, which I think is great, but also great at pulling together the ecosystems. It's outside of the Silicon Valley, the MIT, Boston, the New York, like the startup scene isn't really very aware of Kauffman, but mayors are, governors are, like different stakeholders. So they play a weird spot in the stack that I love. And you and I earlier were talking about science and science of ecosystems and how that's starting to become a bit of a new field. And I have a feeling that'll then lead us a bit to the right to start conversation if we kind of follow this journey down this winding path. And jumping from San Francisco to Kauffman, what was that like getting into the Kauffman Foundation, and what did you do there? And we'll talk about that for a bit. Then I wanted to discuss, did you start to see the science kind of blossom, the science of ecosystems at Kauffman? Or what made that explode, I guess? So tell me about that jump from San Francisco to Kauffman.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting. So I moved from Silicon Valley to the Kauffman Foundation, which is in Kansas City. For those of people that don't know, that was
Yeah.
about 4.5 years ago. I started that, and it's interesting because it was the reverse of the American Frontier Trail. And so the Frontier Trail went from basically the Kansas City area, out to California, Oregon, New Mexico, and so I actually took a personal reverse Frontier Trail, and today I actually live 2 blocks away from where the California Trail went.
Wow.
I could drive, it's literally 2 blocks from my house, and I kind of think, in some ways, it's metaphorical, because I think America is doing its own reverse frontier trail right now. Like, we're trying to rediscover, like, what made the American frontier, so successful, because the frontier kind of ended, right? We kind of went all the way out west, and this country settled itself, and now it's having to rediscover what it already settled again, and it's having to figure out, how do you take that spirit, that essence, that mojo that really moved across this country in terms of its innovative energy, and sort of capture it in a bottle, and sort of bring it back again to places that maybe had it once. And Kansas City was booming. You go back about 90 years, this place was on fire, right, in Kansas City. And it's like what Silicon Valley became later. And you can sort of track the movement of the frontier from east to west across the country over time. There's a whole thesis around Frederick Jackson Turner, the historian who wrote about this, and said you can actually trace the civilization, the history of mankind, by turning America sideways and looking at it reading it like a book. As you see societies kind of emerge from nothingness, and they build communities, they build institutions, they build organizations. And over time, they become more hierarchical and more stratified and more rigid. And he said that's the history of the human race. But how do you actually keep that frontier, fresh, right? So
when you say turn America sideways and read it like a book, you're talking flip it this way, so that you have the Northeast on the upper left corner, and then you read down this way.
That's right. Yeah. Well, if you take the Western U.S. and make it the sort of the top of the book, and then the bottom of the book is sort of where the Northeast was, and even the Southeast as well, where you have basically Frederick Jackson Turner wrote that the institutions of Europe were basically imported into the Northeast and the Southeast, and you have this. They had basically the same types of social strata and social classes, but then as human beings moved west across the frontier, they had to reinvent societies from scratch. And so you saw towns emerge, and they had to create their own set of laws and
their own currencies at one point, their own way of commerce, as they're trying to figure out. My family. I'll show you this here. Hold on. This is one of my favorite things. So my great grandfather's family, they were from Europe, came into New Orleans, hit St. Louis, right? And then west, stopped in Salt Lake. They were making the move with the Mormons, and never really for religious purposes. Economic was their main driver, and they wanted a new opportunity. But they ended up building the first bank west of the Mississippi. And at the time, they weren't even dealing with real currency for the most part out there. And they got a safe off of a group of miners heading to San Francisco. And these are Walker Brother coins that are for the bank, that you would exchange certain currency for to go shop also inside of their store. So they had a dry goods store. So you get this really crazy loop that this is, a bank that was first in the West, one of the most prosperous. They made up the rules, legitimately made up the rules, to where some of the stories in the books are bonkers about how the West was started. And this ties into something that you're touching on that I want to ask about in specific is, we're trying to understand the science of how did this all happen. At some point, don't you think it's just in us when we face a challenge that we do the thing that is kind of like it's a part of us, and we're trying to, it's almost like we're trying to go around the block to get next, one step that way. And I liken it to a little bit of some thinking. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in a second, but I look at the narrative of a Judeo-Christian biblical narrative, and you see this beginning creation story of a garden, super simple. like naked people eating fruit, hanging out, no death, like life's awesome, and had no knowledge of good and evil. Like it's just this very peaceful, like happy, like, hey, kumbaya. This is what everyone's hunting for, right? Happiness, no violence. And then it's like the other end is in Revelation, they talk about there's this tree in a garden and like, oh, hey, they made it there finally, like in this whatever narrative it is, to this other garden. So you have these two trees and gardens as bookends in this story that's been put together. Everything in between is this super brutal narrative of humans trying to struggle to find their way back to where they started at, to get back to this garden. How complex do you think the science is? And do you think at some point we're just going to laugh at ourselves because we're like, the answer is eat dinner with your neighbors and talk about what they love. And it's like, what is wrong with us? Like, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? As kind of that, we're trying to unpack the West, which to get back to humanity.
Yeah, it's so actually it's interesting. I've talked to anthropologists and social scientists who, when you talk about, entrepreneurship and what we're seeing now happen in entrepreneurship as like a leading form of new economic development as people reinvent that. A lot of these social scientists will say, well, you're just getting back to what we've, studied all along, which is essentially the roots of human civilization. And, and so that's, to me, really interesting that what we're talking about is nothing new at all. And,
Right.
And while we're on, that issue, like, a lot of Native American culture kind of operates in the same way. And when the frontier happened, of course, it was the Native American culture that really suffered the most. But in many ways, a lot of the traditions around sustainability and sort of interdependence actually were some, parts of the culture that they had largely cherished and honored. Well, one way I look at this issue around the science is around the analogy of a rainforest. This was a book I wrote called The Rainforest, and basically said that if you want to think about how to grow a truly dynamic economy, you should think about rainforests, because rainforests are a highly rich, highly diverse, highly robust natural ecosystem. And if you contrast a rainforest with the opposite, which is a farm is like the modern economy. It's the industrial economy, where you have a crop that you want to grow, and what you're trying to do is to grow the most corn or wheat or soybeans as you possibly can at the lowest possible price. So it's around maximization and efficiency. You use fertilizers, you use irrigation controls, you do everything you can to maximize the yield of a crop. And you do everything you can to kill weeds, because weeds are the outliers. They're not the crop that you're looking for. Yeah. But if you think about a rainforest, on the other hand, well, what's a weed in a rainforest? Well, everything's a weed in a rainforest. Mm-hmm. And what makes a rainforest work is that you never know what the next weed is going to be that becomes the most valuable plant in the entire rainforest. Like mm-hmm. that weed that's growing out of the ground could become, the crucial pillar of the entire, ecosystem of the rainforest in the future. And so what you want to do is to nurture the growth of weeds so they all have a fair chance to become vibrant. Yeah. And so we want to create rainforests in human society. But the problem then is you think, well, how do you build a rainforest versus a farm? We know how to make farms. You try to control things as much as possible. In rainforests, you can't just plant more trees. People have done that, and the trees die because they don't have the interaction of all the flora and fauna that makes them successful. So what you need to do, though, is control the environment. So the sunlight, the moisture, the humidity, the interactions of all the flora and fauna have to be given time to emerge to nurture the growth of the weeds. Mm-hmm. And so that's, in human systems, is the same way. You can actually say the analogies for all the nutrients, or in biology, they would call it the abiotic forces. It's the interactions that cause these things to happen. That you need to look at the human interactions, the culture, the resources that are actually present within the system and how well they flow. In fact, the speciation, which is the ability of ecosystems to develop new species, is largely a function of energy flow. So within a natural rainforest, it's how well does the sunlight and the water move around and circulate in the system to where it needs to go. And you can think of the human system the same way. So if the factors of production are, basically talent, ideas, capital, and physical resources, how well and how smoothly do they flow within the human ecosystem? And that's largely a function of the relationships we have with each other and the culture and the behaviors that we exhibit in our day-to-day interactions. So how do we build ecosystems is really akin to, how do we actually create, rainforests?
Yeah. On the rainforest piece. So this gets into something that I wrestle with, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on. So the rainforest can sustain a certain balance and a quantity of people, right? Or of things, plants and animals. You get out of whack, and all of a sudden things start to go sideways because everything plays kind of a key role. So two questions are packed inside of that, of the imbalance of a rainforest and the damage it then creates. Because we've seen it, right? When you pull a certain species out of something, it like throws things into a tailspin. There's multiple narratives around that. One question is, we have the variable of these gods of capitalism that have been created. So that kind of skews the rainforest right now. Like, I love the idea of these very like pleasant little towns where everyone lives and like has all the things they need inside the ecosystem, but also it's like you were kind of like that toothpaste is out of the tube in some ways. Like this perfect utopian society that's perfectly balanced, I feel like is up against the forces of, you know, the Walmarts, the Amazons, all of these big players that are crushing and eating these little guys. You can still have boutique experiences that make a town very enjoyable, but I don't know if it makes the rainforest viable, right? And that viability piece is where I'm trying to figure out, how do you import dollars to let people enjoy the belly-to-belly transactions that might not, that make up the rainforest. But at some point, it's almost like we have to artificially infuse something into the rainforest to keep it competitive at this point. And not to blame, look, Bezos, Sam Walton, like Sam played the game better than anybody. He played by the rules. He was just a competitive old man and like just crushed everyone. And his biography is awesome in a lot of ways. There are things I hope to embody, other things not, but like I love a lot about him. However, that skewed the rainforest. So that's one variable I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, of the petri dish of this perfect ecosystem. Feels like, there's these giants right outside the rainforest that are like looking in, and everyone's like, oh, there they are. Then the other question is the rat's nests of cities. You mentioned Native Americans and how they lived very balanced, which I agree. It's so amazing when you start to do the deep dive. And they didn't have to worry about septic infrastructure or sewage infrastructure and like giant tanks to suck up all the feces of all the humans and then treat them and then try and redistribute the water in an ethical way. So we've got this weird scale issue where people are kind of lazy and soft, it feels like, and we want everything to be a comfortable landing pad for us. And so we find like which landing pad has, the oil field jobs, or let's move to Texas for these taxation things. And all of a sudden you get this, well, I want the restaurant where you can eat the vegan foods that taste like Buffalo Wild Wings. And it's like, well, that's neat, but like you could make that at home. It's like people don't want to struggle. And so it feels like we could have a bunch of rainforests, but there's these cushy quote unquote landing pads where people don't have to have the same struggle. So they pick that to have other struggles. How does that play into the rainforest as well? Because there's this like cool utopian picture of like, we're not addressing Walmarts and Amazons, rainforest, awesome. And people are actually have some grit and are willing to go out there and like live in these places and build really cool rainforests away from these key metros, which part of it is happening where people are moving out of the big cities. How do you think about those two variables of the Walmarts, the Amazons, the giants that are looking in the little rainforest, like you can't win? And then these giant cities where, how do we rainforestize those? Does that question make sense? It's a very abstract, but I hope it communicates well.
Yeah, I think I get it. Well, rainforests are not paradise in real life either. I mean, the animals fight like tooth and nail to survive, but rainforests are resilient. That's the difference, right? They're resilient. They adapt, and you can destroy rainforest for sure, but within the rainforest, they adapt better than other ecosystems because things just are richer and they're more adaptive. So those phrases, resilience and emergence and adaptability are things that have been talked about in the fringes of economic development, but haven't really made it center. But I think that's what this is saying, is if you want communities to adapt to the future that's already arrived, they need to be more rainforest-like in their adaptability, not necessarily in like an image of paradise, which I don't think.
Sure.
Life is struggle, as Buddha said, and that's not going away. But do we give people the means so they can struggle well? And I think it ties into your question around, people getting soft and what the giants. I think, there's that scene in the movie Wall-E when they show up and all the people are sitting around drinking Slurpees and watching movies.
Yes.
And when you watch it, it's sort of horrifying. And then you realize, well, that's happened to us. And we live that life now. And if you think about it, what it means is that we've created, well, let me put it this way. I actually saw Jeff Bezos, an old clip of Jeff Bezos. Oh, actually his testimony just a couple of weeks ago in Congress, where he said when he set out to build Amazon, he set out to build the most customer-centric company in the world. And I think he's largely done that. But you think about, if you break apart what he just said, the most customer-centric. So what that means is ease, comfort, convenience, low cost, and basically Wall-E, right? It's that world. And we've essentially gotten the most customer-centric world that we actually were promised by the people that set out to design the economy as it is. But here's the problem. Human flourishing is not just being around a customer, right? It's not just being a customer. You actually have to be a maker as well. You got to be a starter. And I think that's the balance, is we've basically shifted our entire economic focus to becoming customers.
Consumers.
It's very, very easy to be a customer now. I mean, even with the pandemic, there's about half the population that could essentially sit at home and just order everything with a few clicks. And that's the very lucky half. It's the other half that's running around like crazy to service the half. And I kind of think of it as like when you go to Disneyland, it's a perfect customer experience in Disneyland. But then you go behind the scenes and it's a madhouse, right? As people are trying to scurry to give everyone the best possible customer experience. And those people got to work. And that's the same if you take it out of Disneyland and just apply it to our economy as a whole. That's what we have. We have great customer experience for half, and the other half has to work to deliver that customer experience. So if you think of an economy as a business, which it is in a way, what's the UX of the economy? So what's the user experience of the economy? And I'd say our UX today is the customer. But I would say there's a balance there to be struck between the UX as the maker or the starter, the person that builds stuff and makes stuff and starts stuff, because that's where human fulfillment comes from. It's also where innovation comes from and where sustainability comes from. So when we try to build a more dynamic economy, you can't just be completely customer centric, which is what we've been told. And that's where you build gigantic enterprises to deliver customer satisfaction. You also need to be able to give people the chance to make and start. And I'd say by and large as an economy, we have lost the maker as our customer experience. The user experience of the economy doesn't take into account the user need to create and build stuff, which is human nature. Like we all feel better when we do something that makes us feel good because we've created something in the world that didn't exist, right? Human beings. So in college, one of my professors was E.O. Wilson, who's a famous biologist, and he basically, talked about sort of the role of human nature in building a society. And from the very, very beginning of humanity, we have the ability to envision a future that's not there. Out of all animal species, we can tell stories of a future that's not there to each other and organize the resources to do it and then do it. And it can change. That story changes constantly. Yeah, it's magic. No other animal can do that. So the ability to tell stories and to build solutions, well, that's entrepreneurship. Like that's what we do. And we've forgotten that.
Yeah. And when you say, we have forgotten that, I agree with you that we've moved into a consumer phase. It's easy. We love the ease, as you said, and the whole customer-centric mentality. IKEA really mastered it well to where people find a sense of pride in making things, right? There's another study that has to do with the little chocolate cake. I don't know if you ever heard about this study. It's fantastic. When they launched these, it was like the Betty Crocker cake mixes, and they didn't sell it all because it had everything in the box and you just had to pour it in and like a little bit of water and then it was done. And so they pulled out a few of the ingredients, eggs, oil, and you had to add a couple things, sold like hotcakes because now all of a sudden they feel like, oh, I'm making again, right? And part of that coming out of this, so this is a question that gets into a little bit of like theory on economics, and then I want to jump over to kind of right to start in the American dream. Maybe this actually is a leapfrog into American dream. We we've got like people like Andrew Yang who are saying like, hey, universal basic income, it's time we have like a standardized, like, dividend check basically for being an American. I think that goes counter to what you and I are talking about, of like people like that struggle, they like to make and create a little bit. However, we're also kind of faced with a pretty unequal access point for opportunity. We don't want, I want personally, and I think most do, executives, everyone, we want equal access to the opportunity, not equal distribution of opportunity, not equal distribution of wealth. Like, that's a good way to think about it. When we think about people making again, do we need people to make right now? Like, what is your opinion and thought on that? Because when we think about, we got plenty of cheap shit fast from China. Like, that was the game we played in like the 80s and 90s, and we played it really well. And now we play that out, and we're like, I don't know if we want this. What does the future of making look like? You have Chomsky, who would talk about the factory and the people should own the factory. And now, what is this new factory of the knowledge economy, in your opinion? And how do you think about that from a American dream perspective of people need to make and they're happy when they make? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's inherent to human nature to make and start, and any economy that doesn't protect and nourish that is a false prophet. I think you can lull people into complacency by giving them cheap stuff, but like we were saying before, with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it starts to become a very hollow life of just living through consumerism. I think it's interesting thing about hipsterism, the whole culture of hipsterism. I don't know if you've seen this, but hipsterism is the first culture that's ever been documented by social scientists based purely on curating what you consume. Every other culture, sort of cultural iconic movement before, was around what you make, not sort of tailoring what you consume to create your own identity. And I think that's really interesting because we've turned consumerism now into its own art form, and you have to think about what that really, what that means. It means that people have lost people. Well, one, I think it says that people want to create, and they will even create different forms of consumerism to give themselves a sense of fulfillment. But it also says that there's a hole in people's emotional lives right now about their ability to create things. So I think it's very deep. It's not an accident that hipsterism actually led to the creation of sort of boutique businesses to serve that culture, and that has actually become its own celebration of entrepreneurship, which is its own form of creation. So I found that really interesting, that it just sort of wants to gravitate right back around to being able to help people start and make all over again.
How do you think that'll play itself out with? So I love what you said about a country or a culture that's really not facilitating the makers isn't true to itself. And I love that you're identifying that hipsters are turning consumption into a form of making, right? Making art somehow. But to get back to that question of like, what is the highest and best use? So we're just not placating the masses. Like, it's almost, we want people to make things that have real authenticity to them and have value. And that's where I wrestle with what's the highest and best. I want everyone to make, but like making just, for your own self has a certain sense of joy, but in a perfect harmonized rainforest or economy, is it more R&D and less about scaled manufacturing? Because to touch on the Walmarts and the giants and the supply chains and the logistics, the game's been won. Like it flat out has been won of capitalism, to where it's really hard to break into some of the supply chains now. And how you break into them, there's got to be a way that like we make things of some value, but I feel like we have to reconfigure the system to where how these giant industry kings are looking at all these little makers, and how can we ethically, redesign corporate social responsibility and research and development to meaningfully engage the masses to make on their behalf, versus, corp dev is wait for a startup to succeed and then buy it or fail and buy it. And then the other side is CSR is oftentimes like, here's you need books in your community. We're going to buy you books. We're going to buy this, versus aligning their mission as a company that has a future with the passions of the people. Do you think it's possible to realign those interests again? Because they feel very divergent right now, to be honest. CSR for many years was people paying for their sins. Can you harmonize those things?
Yeah, I guess what I'd rethink the perspective at which we're asking the question. So, instead of thinking of, these distribution platforms as corporations, why don't we think of them instead as rails for taking things from people who have ideas and solutions to the people that need those solutions? And if you think of it that way, it's no different than our highway system or our rail system or our water system or our electrical system. They're platforms as opposed to products. I think that's been part of the challenges. We've thought of these distribution systems as products in and of themselves. And that may be necessary in the beginning to get these things going. But ultimately, they're common platforms, they're common carriers, just like our telephone networks are in many ways. And we should be thinking of them differently that way. And then, if the purpose of one of those distribution systems is to most efficiently and effectively get really great solutions from the people that invent them and create them to the people that need them the most, as opposed to a platform that's actually trying to exist for the sake of being its own platform, then I think it really changes how you govern. It changes how you write the laws around the system.
Yep. Well, I like what you're saying. So it's still allowing for these kings of capitalism to be the king on the top of the hill, but also their supply chain, their logistics, some of their, call it infrastructure or utility, is, instead of trying to socialize the whole thing or break up all the companies, it's just how do we ethically reorient how they interact with the creators in a way that gives a fair shake at getting on the platform. So it's not everyone gets to come and play on that platform. There's still a standard of excellence. There's still a target end user. You need to bring something of meaning and value to the game. You don't just get to show up to a Major League Baseball game and say, because I have a uniform and a bat, I get to play in your game. It's like, wow, how have you shown that step up? I like that. And you get to look at a community then as this constant percolating engine of making and creativity with hopes that they're going to bring something to the rail system, right? That scales.
That's right. It's really around looking at an economy from the perspective of how do you get out all the barriers in the way for ideas to become real, to deliver to the person that needs them the most. And in economics, they would talk about transaction costs. So that's how I look at it. And I sort of was, schooled on that whole model. And I think if you think of transaction costs, breaking them down, and just looking at transaction costs everywhere. What are the hurdles and the barriers that get in the way of bringing an idea to life and delivered to the person that needs it the most? Like, then that's like a truly like entrepreneurial society, and that's a truly flourishing society, because then you're able to create solutions for any problem, and you're able to, and then everyone that's got an idea, of which that's infinite, right? Everyone has ideas on how to make things better. They're able to find a way to get that idea out there and, into the hands of people that need it.
It's better than buying a lotto ticket and hoping you win $1 million that way, right? Like, take the cash you spend on the lotto and the time you spend driving there to go build a product with your friends in your garage. And especially if you can have shared environment, like the rainforest, shared language, kind of shared vibe and theme around where it is geographically in the world. If your town specializes in certain industries, or they're shared at the university, the commercialization engine, the R&D dollars they get from the federal government, now you start to see this vertical integration, but it's grassroots vertical integration almost. Like, it's the masses coming together to be like, I have jokingly said Horton Hears a Who may be one of the greatest economic books of all time. Like, if people can find the similar voice to where they all chant together, you just might be heard on your little puffball, because it's like so many of these small cities are the puffballs, and no one believes the elephant that's listening. Like, Victor's the new elephant. It's like, I think I hear you down there. You're here?
Yeah, I think it's like in the 90s, there was a whole movement with the Electronic Freedom Foundation around, information wants to be free. And I think we still
Hmm.
find that. It's information naturally wants to be free. It's just sort of the nature of the universe. And I think we
Yeah.
can also say something about, ideas. Ideas want to become real, and people want to make them, and we should create systems that actually let those ideas actually get tested out in the world.
Yeah.
And when we suppress it, we're actually suppressing human potential, and we're suppressing our own prosperity as a society.
Or, and beyond suppression, when we only invite certain people to the dance, we get a small pool to quote unquote dance with. And when you think about the current R&D model of, publicly traded companies and large privately held companies, it's a pretty select pool. And you go to then the X Prize and the Tech Stars, which I think are great. Don't get me wrong. I think X Prize has done wonders for democratizing access to big problems and trying to invite the folks in. However, you still get, the SEAL Team 6 of the nerds globally that go and tackle a project. You don't get Joey Bag of Donuts who's like, yeah, let me go fix this problem. There's this friend of mine from Silicon Valley. He would always say, Nick, you go and turn Joey Bag of Donuts into an innovator. And it's like, yeah, that's what I believe. I think you and I both have a similar belief that Joey has so much potential to give to the world. And it's like, how do we nurture that thinking? And this maybe gets into the right to start component. How do we, two points. One, describe right to start and what the goal is and kind of key things you're focusing on. And then secondarily, maybe answer your thinking and approach to how do you get, Joey Bag of Donuts into the game? Because you said information wants to be free, ideas want to become real. Well, sure, but we also are lonelier, sicker, depressed, a mess. Economically, we're living in the time of Wall-E. And it's like, all right, how do we get Joey's idea heard, shaped, communally built, validated to a point of technology readiness or product readiness, and brought onto the rail system? Like, do you have some and you don't have to answer the full loop, because look, I've been spending 7 years trying to answer that, and I'm still banging my head against the wall, having wins and losses. But I'd love to hear some of the basic meat and potatoes of right to start. Like, we got to do these things, if that makes sense. So what is right to start, and how do we get Joey in the game?
So Right to Start is an advocacy campaign to make sure that everyone in America has equitable access to entrepreneurial opportunity, regardless of race, place, gender, background, heredity, circumstance. And so we're fighting for the idea of the ability to make and start stuff as actually core to the American dream. And that gets embodied in a bunch of different ways. But I guess I think of one analogy, which is if you think of every issue that matters to American life, there's actually an advocacy infrastructure in place. So if you believe in guns rights, you got the NRA. If you believe in civil liberties, you got the ACLU. If you believe in entrepreneurial opportunity as an equitable right, what do you belong to? Like, how do you get engaged? How do you give voice to that issue? Well, the truth is there is no advocacy infrastructure for that right now. And the reason being that people who are entrepreneurs are usually too cash strapped and too busy hustling to advocate for themselves. So you have potentially the most important segment of the population without a political voice. And Right to Start is really looking at giving voice to those voiceless people. And we're doing it through 3 different ways: changing minds, policies, and communities. With changing minds, we're trying to elevate the discourse. So if you polled Americans on the most critical issues to American life, entrepreneurship probably wouldn't be in the top 30 issues, even though the research shows that new businesses are the source of almost all job growth, productivity, dynamism, and mobility in society. And the data also shows that entrepreneurship has fallen by roughly half over the last several decades in this country. Like, fewer and fewer people are actually starting businesses. We're barely replacing closed businesses with new ones right now. Changing policies, actually getting legislation, laws, policies, programs rewritten so they support entrepreneurs as a society. And then changing communities, engaging ordinary Americans in this effort. So an entrepreneur is not just that other person. 3 out of 1,000 people every month start a new business. But what the research is pretty clear on is that what the 997 do to help those 3 is pretty much determinative of whether those 3 are going to succeed or not. So entrepreneurship is not just something for other people to do. It's something that all of us have to care about and engage in. One of the reasons we call this the right to start is because we really view it's a fundamental right. Like, just like the rights to speech and worship and assembly and religion, you have a right to start something. The only thing, the reason it wasn't written into the founding of the country is because it was just assumed, of course you have a right to start. You know, the founders of the country were almost all entrepreneurs in some way or other. They ran either their own businesses or started or were running small businesses of some kind. And it's true, there were many people left out, including African Americans and Native Americans. But for the basic core idea, the promise of the country, even though it wasn't perfect, it was that everyone has the right to start, to kind of build their life, to create their thing. And so what we're doing is articulating what was always there. It was always inherent in the founding of America. America is the quintessential startup nation in the world. It's still, and I think we just took it for granted. I think it just withered away. And what we're doing with Right to Start is actually fighting for bringing that voice back and engaging people in that process. So we're recruiting people to join this effort. We're engaging policymakers in this. We're trying to get the voice out there and actually, fight for this issue.
We talk about the policy and the community side for a second. One, what's a practical policy that you think everyone should just do this in your community, like at the mayoral, governor, federal? Is there like a policy that you look at and go, no brainer? And then the other thing is, let's pretend I'm a community member in a town somewhere and I'm like, I want to get involved with Right to Start. What does that mean? Like, how do I do it? And like, what's the other, like, go do this as a community member in the country thing for like a community member? Because you said 997 make the difference whether or not those three win. So what does that look like to answer those? Policy, and then community,
Yeah, policy, Well, we've got a bunch of does, which are on our website at righttostart.org. We've got a list of 11 policy ideas that we think are relevant today to our current economic crisis. And they're inspired and sort of weaved into a larger set of initiatives. So the 11 are called Ready to Start. Those are things you could do right now from a policy perspective. And that's across local, state, and federal policy. And then that's actually part of a bigger thing called America's New Business Plan, which is a larger roadmap of 43 policy ideas that we published at Kauffman Foundation last November, right before I left. And that's a very deep.
Is there one?
I'll tell you the one.
Duh?
So one duh out of all of them is, people that want to start a new business. If it's a small home-based business, like a kid selling lemonade on the street or in a neighborhood corner, or someone making food neighbors, like baked bread, you shouldn't have to, pay a $200 food permit to do that. You shouldn't have to get a kid to pay a $50 license fee to do that kind of thing. And crazily enough, like, that's what exists right now. So at the very, very simplest level, let people just make small things. And I've had some people say, well, that's just a small thing. That doesn't really move the needle when it comes to job creation and all that. But I'll tell you, everything big starts small. And Marriott Hotels was started by Bill Marriott, where he took a family restaurant he got from his parents and turned it into the largest most successful hotel chain in the world. So for people that say they know where the next great thing is going to come from, they're just wrong. They really don't know where it's going to come from.
You're so right on that. And to that point, I love restaurants that are in houses. So like Austin, Texas, you go there, some communities allow for this, and you'll see it, and it somehow fits in a certain code. And whenever you do that, it feels like you're getting to hang out in a different vibe away from like the strip mall or the big downtown or what have you. I have been saying during this pandemic, one of the things that would be magical is if we lowered the barrier on, like, if people make under a certain price point on selling food, then we should just laissez-faire, just let it run, right? Like, don't get into weird stuff of like, you got to have the health inspection come through. Like, if it's under, $200 a week, like, can we just trust humanity not to be complete idiots? And over a certain, barrier, like, let's get health involved somehow. Don't know what that number is. Not going to pretend I'm smart enough to. But what I would give to be able to open up an app that I could just see, or like a community website that was run by the city where all these like fun little food options were sitting on. I'm like, I want to go to that person's house and try that weird baklava everyone's been talking about. It would be so fantastic. And yet everyone's afraid to take that step because of the barriers. And so when you say it's little things and people go, that's small, you hit it right on the head, because the fear of starting, of what landmine am I about to step in, causes paralysis for so many people. And if it was because we're trying to be cautious, or if it's because we were trying to create walls and barriers and insulation to success that's already won, we've done a damn good job at causing people to want to just sit back and go like, I can't do anything. Like, I can't start. I just need to go get a job somewhere. So your little idea is a definite duh, and I love it.
Yeah, it's like pebbles in a stream. We've thrown little pebbles into the stream, and we turn around after decades or centuries, and it's turned into a dam, right? And
Yep.
and
Yes.
those pebbles are many kinds. It's not just the $50 permit here or there.
No.
It's also, you think about our education systems. Do we even teach kids how to make their own things anymore? You can get a high school diploma and not be able to survive like the day after you graduate. You think about our tax system, you think about
Yep.
our regulatory system, you think about economic development, you think about healthcare and student debt and
Yep.
R&D and patents, all that. Inventors go bankrupt trying to protect their inventions from large corporations now. The
Yep.
system is fundamentally skewed away from the little person trying to make little things happen. But that's where everything big starts from. And you've got to honor that and recognize that.
Well, from an educational standpoint, one of my favorite anecdotal stories is one of the communities where we run Innovation Collective in has this incredible, somewhat retired individual who is a co-creator of a very complex camera, and very famous roboticist, understands light fields, all these crazy things. Developer, coder, maker, just wanted to like teach a class at the school around robotics. Oh, they couldn't. They had to take like all these courses to make sure that they were accredited so that they could actually teach at like the freshman level or whatever, middle school level. This is the creator of this beautiful device that was sold to a multi-billion-dollar corporation, and this is like the man who invented it. And you're like, nope, 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 nope. You can't teach here. You're not good enough for a freshman. And it's like things like that make you just giggle and make you go, ah, I'm gonna lose my mind. Talk to me about the community standpoint. What's one thing in the community level that you think, neighbors could start to do that is just like the duh moment to kind of get us back on the rails for the American dream?
Yeah. Well, one idea we're actually propagating, we want to push at right to start, and it's already starting to happen, is what we call start warming parties. So it's like a housewarming party, but for people starting something new, like a new business project or something like that. And it's like people have housewarming parties to celebrate a new house, but we don't really celebrate new businesses. In fact, people are kind of embarrassed and shy when they launch them, and they're done very, very quietly. But we consider those acts of heroism. It's actually really takes a lot of courage to launch a new business idea. And some of them are very small. You start out on Kickstarter or sell something on Etsy or bake bread for your neighbors and start selling that. We should celebrate that. And so what we want to do is to encourage start warming parties to start happening. And if you go on our website, we actually put some basic instructions on how you do a start warming party. It's really easy.
Awesome.
You just basically say, hey, I'm starting something, and invite people over. And, at least one of them should be a policymaker, because that person can help affect change in the broader community. But one thing we see definitely happen is, policymakers. I spend a lot of time with, mayors and representatives and council people and Congress people, and they don't believe it or not, they don't get to meet enough entrepreneurs. Like they often say, yeah, I'd love to meet one, because they're quiet, right? Entrepreneurs are too busy to have a voice. And so a start warming party is a way to make it visible. Let's make the invisible act of heroism happening in your neighborhood all the time and bring it out into the open so everybody can see it. So if you go on our website, righttostart.org, you can actually find it. Also subscribe to our newsletter there. It's easy, but you asked about what's one thing people can do. Just, hope if you hear a friend about to start something or sell something online, host a little celebration for them and invite friends over, and you can do it on Zoom. You don't have to do it in a living room to be safe this year, but there's a lot of things you can do.
I love that. And it's the simple little things like that not only, I think give people the confidence to continue forward, but it sparks whomever else in the room, right? Like what else is going on inside of people that they're like, I have had my thing. It's time for me now. And we need more of that in a big, big way. And on that point, looking at the current state politically, it's pretty rough. at times. Economically, granted, yes, the market might be up, but is it truly an equitable moment right now in our country? Like, I don't think so. And there's a lot of people who are really hurting emotionally and financially. And I don't think it's going to get really rosy coming out of November, regardless of whomever wins politically. Not a political statement at all. But I do love I think it was Safi Bakal said from Loon Shots when he said, whoever wins this fall, it's going to be like they're showing up to a party where all the food has been eaten, all the dancing has been done, and the only thing left is to do the dishes. It's like, it's just whoever wins is gonna have this like weighty moment of reality, right?
And not to mention the debt. I mean, as a society, it's not just our national debt, consumer debt, business debt is at an all-time high. So we've been living a debt-fueled, illusion for decades now, and it's all going to be coming home soon.
Yes, it's going to come home to roost. And so, with the health scenario, the political scenario, the economic scenario, the breaking of education, kind of at the collegiate level, the high school level, there's a lot of shift happening. Super uncomfortable. I personally think like we're going to a really painful time, which could be beautiful. But when you think about the American dream, kind of the science of ecosystems, are you hopeful?
I am, because, well, it's like Martin Luther King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think similarly around the arc of human progress, right? If you look historically, right, in the short run, it's always dismal because the challenges are always so big. But over the long run, you look over the last century, as a world, we've managed to reduce poverty immensely, and we've managed to reduce, warfare immensely. I mean, if you just look at the raw numbers, the number of people that die from poverty or war has fallen dramatically over the past century compared to all centuries before that.
Yeah.
So on the whole, right, in the long term, I'm optimistic, but in the short run, you're right. We've got some serious challenges, and there's a real question whether America is going to be, what it was. And it looks like increasingly, at least from my perspective, it's not going to be. Just we've got too much. We've got so much baggage now on this stuff.
Yeah.
But can we rebuild a lot of it? Yeah, absolutely. And can we recover, what brought our society to what it is? I think that we can, in large part, if not exceed it. And I think it's it's going back to the roots of, what makes people and what makes societies thrive. So on the whole, I'm optimistic.
Getting out of our own way. Like, you touched on this, and this is maybe a good place to start to kind of wrap up. Policy, removing kind of the dam that all these little pebbles make. Talking to your neighbors again and celebrating their success, right? Like, this is not complex, right? It's just getting out of our own way, getting out of our own heads. Maybe we thought it was easier to touch a button and have something just show up. But like, is that truly what you need, is just more stuff in your home all the time? We are in a tough spot, but I think right to start is such a funny thing. You said it, how people have just forgotten that we assumed everyone knew they had the right to start.
Mm-hmm.
And the saddest thing we see is when we go into a new community, we'll start telling people what's going on. Like, well, who gave you the permission? It's like, this is not Footloose. Like, you can dance if you want to. Welcome to America. Like, that's the beauty of this country. And where did we forget that little piece? And slowly, piece by piece, people who come out to these events, they find this inspiration and say, well, I want to go start this. So hopefully we can get back to the roots and the simplicity of what really makes us feel alive as humans, helps us flourish, creates more beauty, creates more value, and just start with the little things. I love your basic, call out for all people. Doesn't matter if you're a policymaker, a CEO, a little kid, a senior citizen. Go celebrate something someone's making in your town, like hard stop, your start warming parties. And people can go to your website, righttostart.com, sign up for the newsletter. .org. I apologize.
Yeah.
Righttostart.org. Sign up for the newsletter and also review the different policy kind of agenda items. Look at the start warming parties, kind of follow your journey in what you're doing and cheer you on, contribute meaningfully however they can. Anything else that you'd say kind of in parting?
Yeah, I think people just want a fair shot at the American dream, and for some people, it's much harder than others, and we've got to be really proactive about it. So I like to say, if you want a level playing field, you got to tilt it. You got to tilt it back in favor of little guys and gals trying to start stuff, and it's undeniable there are certain people that for whom it's harder than others. And so we welcome people to be involved in this. This is our goal: is to build this, this invisible army of people that support entrepreneurs, and come onto our site and join the army, join the movement. We need you, and we want you.
Well, and I want to call something out in particular. A lot of people, when they say you got to tilt the playing field to make it level, the first thing they say is, that's bullshit. Now you're trying to rig the game for the common man and screw over the big guy. Here's the truth: the quicker we can empower the masses to play the game again, the more everyone wins. And it's not about equal distribution of wealth. It's equal distribution of opportunity. And if we can find a clear path to those rails, mark my words, let these big industries get bigger. These big players win. As long as there's inclusive opportunity of the unleashing of creativity and the commercialization, the productization, and move markets forward to create more value and more beauty, they can get bigger. Because as we have an AI-based system with a fiduciary responsibility for reducing the size of companies, look, you have responsibility for publicly traded to actually lay off people if you can. Like, that sucks in part, but also that's what makes the market work how it does. So in theory, let's go extrapolate out like 50 years. It's quite possible publicly traded companies are nothing more than an algorithm and a brand. Like, that's terrifying to think about. Like, if it was full automation all the way. So what do we do with the masses? We better have some good policy that, Victor, you better come up with, that figures out how to get all the executives who are going to be unemployed to get cool ideas back onto their AI branded companies' platforms so they can make some money back in the loop. So who knows?
If we're able to achieve that human flourishing we're talking about, everyone benefits. Even the big players will benefit, because they'll be able to. They'll have the rail system that lets the stuff move around, in the best way. And so you can imagine a society where everybody gets to be a part of it.
I agree. I'm super grateful for your time today. Thank you for making time, and thank you for what you're doing. And I can't wait to see the policy changes that come out of this and the unleashed potential in humanity. So we're grateful for you.
Thank you, Nick. It's a real honor to be part of the show.